My brother made my life hell, got my wife pregnant, and now wants my help after our parents disowned him and left me their $2 million inheritance. My younger brother Jake has always held a deep resentment toward me. If you think it stemmed from jealousy, you'd be wrong. He was the favored child, not me. There was no reason for him to be envious. To give you some context, our mother always doted on Jake. He was the golden child of the family. She cooked for him, did his laundry, and even asked me to help him with his schoolwork. I was expected to support him just because we were family, but I never received the same treatment. I accepted it because I was quite independent. Maybe it was partly my fault for always meeting his needs without expecting anything in return. Jake never helped me when I needed it, and only came to me when he wanted something. I was a quiet, introverted kid who loved studying and keeping to myself, while Jake was loud and rough, just like our dad. I also tend to be direct and honest, never sugarcoating things. I think my mother may have developed a negative perception of me because of my bluntness. This favoritism made Jake the family's darling, which I didn't mind as a child. But as we grew older, problems started to arise. Jake began to bully me and mock me for being different from him. He'd tease me about my height and the fact that I wore glasses. He'd sneak into my room, read my diary, and then complain to my mom about what I'd written. When I got angry and complained to our parents about him invading my privacy, they'd laugh it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. Jake did worse things like nearly breaking my glasses and putting disgusting things in my food. Once he even put small stones in my cereal, but luckily I noticed them before they could damage my teeth. When I told my mom, she brushed it off, saying, "This is how brothers bond." Whenever we fought, Jake would target my insecurities to hurt me. Since we went to the same school, he knew I was being bullied by some kids. Instead of supporting me, he sided with the bullies, calling me names like loser or hairy monkey, and encouraging them to physically hurt me, saying I was just a big failure. One time, during an argument over something trivial that I can't even remember, he told me to kill myself. While I could usually brush off most of his insults, that one really stung because I was struggling with my mental health at the time. I'm doing better now, but hearing that my own brother wanted me dead was devastating. Our dad was often at work, and our mom didn't seem to care much. She even scolded me once, saying it was my fault for annoying Jake. Things escalated in high school. There was a shocking incident where Jake tried to set my hair on fire. Incredibly, our mother defended him, claiming he was just playing around. But who acts like that? Thankfully, my dad finally stepped in. He recognized how serious the situation was and threatened to call the police if Jake didn't stop. This was a turning point for Jake because he had never faced consequences for his actions. He was visibly shocked, and my dad made it clear that he needed to start respecting me as his older brother. Later, my dad came to talk to me in my room. I didn't expect his support because he'd always told Jake how similar they were, which was true. But that day, he admitted that he had been waiting for years, hoping Jake would grow up, but he was starting to realize Jake was becoming a big bully. Hearing this from my dad was incredibly validating, and I nearly broke down in tears. I finally told my dad everything Jake had done to me over the years, including the bullying I endured at school. He was shocked by how much I had silently suffered. The next day, he spoke with the school principal to ensure the bullies were warned about facing serious consequences if their behavior continued. That evening, Dad enrolled me in MMA classes at a local gym, telling me I needed to stand up for myself and confront the bullies in my life. At first, the idea of a nerdy kid like me learning to fight might have seemed laughable, but I was determined. I managed my time carefully to balance my studies with my daily workouts, and the MMA training transformed my life, both mentally and physically. One day, Jake was back to his usual tricks. He stole my pocket money, which we received for helping out with chores. I had been saving it for a while, and Jake sneaked into my room to take it. I caught him just as he was about to cycle off with his friends. When I demanded my money back, Jake mocked me, saying all I ever did was run to Dad for help. Something snapped inside me, and before I realized it, I punched him in the face. He stumbled backward in shock, and I retrieved my money from his pocket before pushing him away. Jake began crying loudly, which was oddly amusing, but then our mother rushed outside to see what had happened. When she found out I had fought Jake, she was surprised and scolded me, insisting that I should set a better example as the older sibling. Jake seemed to enjoy watching me get reprimanded. Mom later complained to Dad about my behavior, claiming I needed to be controlled. That evening, Dad sternly asked both of us to explain ourselves. I told him how Jake had stolen the money I'd worked hard to save. Jake tried to justify his actions, saying he needed the money for a date and that, as his brother, I should have helped him. Dad didn't buy it. He told Jake he was lucky I only punched him, as anyone else would have called the police for theft. Dad made it clear to Jake that he had no right to take what wasn't his without permission. Jake didn't like hearing this and threw a tantrum, likely hoping Mom would take his side. But Dad stood firm. Realizing he wasn't going to be coddled, Jake screamed that he hated me before storming off to his room and locking himself inside. After that incident, Jake began to distance himself from me. He finally understood he couldn't bully me anymore, and even Dad had stopped tolerating his antics. For the first time in my life, I felt like we were equals. Although Jake couldn't physically harm me anymore, he resorted to verbal insults when our parents weren't around. His behavior grew worse as he got older. He became angrier and more short-tempered with each passing year. If I asked him a question, he'd ignore me, muttering insults like nerd or loser under his breath. When he needed to tell me something, he'd go through our mother instead of speaking to me directly. When I asked Mom why Jake couldn't just talk to me, she'd urge me to be more understanding. I couldn't tell if it was just teenage rebellion or genuine hatred. Over time, his constant insults became unbearable, and I started longing to move out and get away from him. I repeatedly asked my mother to mediate a conversation between us to resolve our issues, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. When I asked her why Jake treated me this way, she'd brush off the question entirely. Eventually, I left for my dream university after earning a scholarship as a top student. My dad threw a party to celebrate, and even my mom seemed proud of me for once. Jake remained cold and distant, barely acknowledging my achievements even on the day I left for university. For me, it was a bittersweet moment, a mix of excitement for the future and relief to escape the toxic environment of my childhood home. The first few months at university were a revelation. I made new friends, thrived in my classes, and finally started to build a life free from the oppressive shadow of my brother. For the first time, the constant anxiety of Jake's verbal abuse was gone, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced before. During my second year, I met Karen at a fraternity party through a mutual friend. We clicked instantly. And coming from a traditional and religious background, having children outside of marriage was heavily frowned upon. So when Karen and I found out she was pregnant in our final year, we decided to marry right after graduation. Our wedding was a small, joyful affair. Both sets of parents were happy for us, and the celebration was intimate and filled with love. At that moment, I genuinely believed Karen was the love of my life. I had always envisioned a faithful, monogamous marriage with one person to share my life with. Despite attention from other women over the years, I never strayed. I was truly content with Karen. She was my dream girl, and I never wanted to hurt her. But life had other plans. Over time, I uncovered 2 separate incidents of infidelity during our marriage. The first was an on-again, off-again affair with a married co-worker that spanned several years. The second was a brief fling with her ex-boyfriend during a visit to her family. Looking back, I can admit I was naive, even though I desperately wanted to believe in the integrity of our relationship. Both times we separated for a while, but I ultimately chose to forgive Karen. I didn't want our child to grow up in a broken home. I convinced myself that her actions were youthful mistakes and poor judgment that we could work through. For a while, things improved. Although I could never fully trust her again, I made a conscious effort to move forward. If I chose to forgive, I knew I had to give our marriage a genuine chance. It has been 4 years since her second betrayal, and I felt reassured in my decision to stay. Karen seemed like she had truly changed, and together we were happy and excitedly planning our future as a family. But 3 months ago, my world was shattered again. Karen confessed she had been having a long-term affair and dropped an even more devastating bombshell. She wasn't sure if our son was mine. Her words hit me like a freight train. I was paralyzed with shock, betrayal, and disbelief. My mind raced, trying to process the enormity of her confession. Once the initial numbness subsided, I managed to ask her why she had hidden this for so long and how she could do something so cruel, but her reaction was chillingly indifferent. She seemed detached from the pain she had caused. Karen's vague answers only deepened my confusion and hurt. I kept pressing her for the truth, desperate to know who the real father of the child I had raised was. Finally, she admitted the unthinkable: Jake. My heart sank. My mind couldn't process her words at first. I asked her to explain, to clarify what she meant. She told me that after I introduced her to my family, she and Jake became close. That year, Karen stayed with my family from Thanksgiving until New Year's. Jake, who had always been cold and dismissive toward me, was warm and polite toward her. At the time, I was relieved, thinking it meant Karen felt welcome and comfortable with my family. Karen said she spent a lot of time with my mom, trying to fit in and build a bond with my family. She noticed the strained relationship between Jake and me and even asked me about it once. I never imagined her curiosity about my brother would lead to this level of betrayal. I shared with Karen the rocky relationship I had with Jake, explaining that our bond had always been fractured and likely irreparable due to his unresolved feelings. She seemed to understand but began including Jake in our outings, hoping it might help bridge the gap. If we planned to see a movie, she would invite Jake, and we'd always watch whatever he picked. During this time, Jake and I exchanged a few words, more than we had in years, which felt like a small step forward. I remember Karen and Jake spending time together playing video games, but it didn't raise any red flags. Karen later told me that Jake had opened up to her about his struggles with a recent breakup. Feeling vulnerable, he leaned on her for support, and their friendship grew from there. Karen confessed that Jake would flirt with her harmlessly when I wasn't around, but things eventually escalated beyond her control. The thought of my wife and brother crossing that line made me feel physically ill. She admitted she felt guilty afterward and ended things with Jake, which explained her abrupt decision to leave and spend New Year's away from me that year. I had tried to convince her to stay, but she insisted on going home. When we reunited back at college after the holidays, Karen seemed her usual cheerful self, so I never suspected anything. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. That's when Karen admitted she wasn't sure if the child was mine or Jake's. With no way to confirm the paternity at the time, she chose to stay with me, explaining that I was the more reliable brother. That revelation shook me to my core. The son I had loved and raised might not even be mine. I asked Karen if she and Jake had been involved recently, and she hesitated before admitting the truth. They had never truly stopped. Karen revealed that they had stayed in touch, unable to deny their chemistry. They would meet at hotels, lying to me about work commitments. She even confessed that half of her business trips had been romantic getaways with him. When I asked why she married me if she wanted Jake, her answer stung. She admitted she didn't want to be the one to end our relationship. Karen said she saw me as a dependable partner and a great father to our son, so she stayed. In her words, she had made a mistake and didn't know how to stop. I told Karen I appreciated her honesty but informed her that I was leaving. She started crying, asking for forgiveness, and seemed to expect me to explode in anger. Instead, I calmly began packing my belongings. Karen insisted that if I truly loved her, I should fight for her and reminded me that mistakes happen in every marriage. When she realized I wasn't budging, she changed tactics. Karen argued that a divorce would negatively affect our son and that children shouldn't grow up in broken homes. I reminded her that I might not even be his father, which only made her cry harder. She accused me of being cruel, seemingly unable to comprehend that her actions had pushed me to this point. It was almost as if she thought I would never leave, no matter what. Perhaps I had enabled that belief by letting so many things slide in the past. While I had loved Karen, it was more tied to the life we had built together and the son I thought was mine. Karen kept pleading, insisting it wasn't too late to repair our relationship, but I couldn't believe her anymore. Trust had been completely destroyed, and her words felt empty. Even if I forgave her, I knew I could never forget what she had done, especially with Jake. I've always believed in second chances because everyone makes mistakes, but this went far beyond what I could accept. I left Karen crying on the doorstep and checked into a hotel. The next morning, I went to my parents and told them everything. I laid it all out. Karen's years-long affair with Jake and how they had been secretly meeting behind my back. The look of shock on their faces said it all. True to her nature, my mother reacted exactly as I expected.